From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Whether it's out on the streets or in liberated prisons and detention cells,
they run as free men for the first time in years, escaping the confines of Syria's prisons.
Many in Syria are celebrating the fall of Assad and the end of his autocratic, oppressive, torturous rule. But what of the leader of the group who led the overthrow?
هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للامه الاسلاميه باكملها. هذا النصر يا اخواني تاريخ جديد للمنطقه. كم تلافينا من مخاطر.
Abu Muhammad al-Jolani is a militant Islamist, an alumnus of al-Qaeda, and his HTS group is a proscribed terrorist organisation in the US and UK. However, Western intelligence agencies aren't just concerned about al-Jolani's ideology, but maybe more importantly, the security void that is opening up in Syria, and groups like ISIS, which may exploit it. It's a warning the US president, still Joe Biden, spoke of on Sunday.
We're clear-eyed about the fact that ISIS will try to take advantage of any vacuum to reestablish its capabilities and to create a safe haven. We will not let that happen.
The story today, ISIS and the new Syria.
I'm Mark Urban. I write for the Sunday Times, and I was, for many years, a BBC correspondent.
When we last had you on the podcast last week, you said, quote, "I would say it's still not safe to assume that Assad will survive this crisis." Well, obviously, he now hasn't. What did you make of that final 24 hours?
Well, I mean, of a sort of completely rudderless system that had actually stopped fighting several days before. I mean, I think when we spoke last week, the clear signal one could see from Aleppo was that the security forces and the military had just completely failed to resist effectively. There had been some attempts at resistance, but that this boded very ill for Assad, because when Aleppo fell, Assad was visiting Moscow, which, you know, in the whole business of sort of coups and revolutions, it never helps when you're out of the country. But he did come back and did appear in public with the Iranian foreign minister a week ago Sunday, which was all an attempt to sort of try and steady the ranks, I suppose, and tell people, no, I'm here, everything's going to be okay. But I think, as I say, that what had happened in Aleppo and what was, you know, happening on the road to Hama and other places did already cause one to have quite serious doubts about the ability of the government to hang on.
And now in Damascus, all eyes are on, instead, the leader of this HTS group, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. It seems like his origins, in terms of what we're looking at now, go back to 2003 and the US invasion of Iraq, and he was part of some of that anti-Western resistance there, working with groups like al-Qaeda, is that right? Yes, I mean, I think he himself has dated his sort of political awakening to the Second Intifada in the Palestinian-occupied territories, and said that he sort of became involved in sort of political Islamism from that date onwards. But you're right that what then happened was that after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, he did become involved with the groups that were fighting the Americans, the Mujahideen they called themselves, but they then evolved into various jihadist groups, and you had, you know, al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, as it was called, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And you did have, even as far back as 2006, the emergence of something in Iraq called the Islamic State, which was an offshoot group which tried to sort of declare an Islamic emirate even back then. And some of these people, like Jolani and some of the other fighters in the Mujahideen, were, I think, from quite an early stage, sort of not happy with that direction. And I think if one was going to try and put it in layman's terms, what they all have in common,
the people on that fringe of Arab militancy is a belief that the fairest and best system by which to regulate a society is Sharia, is Islamic law, and that society should be governed by it, and that leaders should govern in the spirit of Islamic law. But then you have these differences of interpretations. So obviously with the Islamic State, they went off in a much more almost messianic direction, talking about, the possibility of an almighty battle between civilizations, the need to purify society, the need to have a system of power that went back 1,000 years, seeing the sort of way that things were run in Islamic states back in the time of the Prophet, or, even in the first few centuries after that, to say, no, this is the model. Things like, stoning to death of adulterers or whatever should be taken literally and should be our model today. Whereas some of the other jihadists, holy warriors or mujahideen, didn't think that and thought, no, we can do things differently. And in the war that unfolded in Iraq, particularly around the time 2005, 2006, the more extreme factions started to adopt what was called takfiri ideology, which was takfiris were the people who had become apostates, effectively. Their interpretation of Islam meant that you couldn't consider them to be Muslims or even one of the monotheists, Christians or Jews either. They were worse than those groups in the eyes of the jihadists. And of course, we're thinking principally in the Iraq context at that time of the Shia population. A big part of the jihadist ideologists have always thought of the Shia as heretics, effectively. And the takfiri ideology was that you should conduct a sort of campaign of wholesale murder against people you consider takfiri, in that sense, the Shia. And Jolani, similarly, did not like that interpretation of what jihad was. Was more focused on the occupier and that kind of thing, less on this battle to kill other Arabs who happened to be Shia.
And that route took him back to Syria at the behest of Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS at the time, in around 2011, I beg your pardon. He then splits with ISIS, partly getting into some of those reasons that you were talking about there. And then he's part of this Al-Nusra Front, which is is the forerunner to this group that we've seen now over in parts of Syria. How clearly are they practicing what they preach, do you think, in terms of what you're explaining there about, being more focused on the occupier than on murdering sort of fellow Muslims?
Well, of course, yeah. Well, Syria is a civil war, of course. The sect that Bashar al-Assad belongs to and his family are even further out there if you're a Sunni jihadist cleric. And therefore, the jihadists who were fighting in Syria regarded their government as a sort of unholy, unclean thing that had to be opposed in all ways possible. And the Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra Front, which Jolani, if you like, cleaved off from the mainstream al-Qaeda movement, it certainly governed in an Islamist way. So yes, they had their local, Sharia courts, religious courts. There were standards of modesty that I think were applied to women and to people going out. Always, though, in Syria, because of the complex reality, if you were Christian, then you were exempted from some of that and not expected, obviously, if you were a woman, to cover yourself in the same way. All that. So there are always shades of this. But I think the other key thing to get clear for listeners is that around this time, as the Syrian civil war really takes off and gets going in earnest, various outside forces get involved. And for various reasons to do with a sort of ideological proximity, Qatar becomes the big sponsor of Jolani's movement, the Nusra Front. And Qatar has quite close ideological underpinnings, quite close to President Erdogan in Turkey. So that was all quite handy and joined up, because the bit of Syria that the Nusra Front ended up penned into was the bit bordering Turkey. So Erdogan could facilitate supplies and travel and all the rest of it. And in a way, this province, Idlib, remained unconquerable because the jihadists had been shoved up there from lots of other places in Syria. They had a lot of experienced fighters. They had the supply network coming through Turkey. They had Qatari money to keep everything going. And that's what Jolani's party became.
And how much do you buy that rebrand? So if you've a man here who has emerged, as we've been discussing, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the rest, he has changed his name, he's got rid of that nom de guerre. As you mentioned, he said he's going to respect these different minorities.
No one has the right to erase another group. These sects have coexisted in this region for hundreds of years, and no one has the right to eliminate them. There must be a legal framework that protects and ensures the rights of all, not a system that serves only one sect, as Assad's regime has done.
Will that hold, do you think?
Well, look, you're at a moment where there's sort of enormous joy in Syria. You know, the overthrow of the Assad system is something that every Syrian pretty much, except for a pretty small coterie who were engaged with the repressive apparatus around Assad, can agree is a good thing. Let's not minimize what a national cataclysm it was. The best estimates are over 600,000 people killed, 15 million people lost their homes. Of those, around half, just over 7 million, ended up refugees in other countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. It was a massive cataclysm, hundreds of thousands of people who disappeared. We see now the images of these people. It's like something out of the Count of Monte Cristo, you know, staggering out of a dungeon, having been in there for 30 or 40 years with pale skin and beards. And
some with children and a toddler.
Yeah, the most shocking abuse of people. One guy who, you know, showed up, Assad, the father's son, in some show jumping event, had been in jail for 43 years.
Living facilities that have been described as human slaughterhouses under Assad's decades-long rule that many activists have called a kingdom of silence. They are among thousands of individuals arrested for opposing President Assad during and since the 2011 uprising.
So, yes, look, there will be enormous joy and there will be some goodwill, which Jolani will clearly try to harness. And part of that, I think, is to try and reassure communities. And you know, Syria's a real tapestry. It's very different to a country like Libya, where following the revolution, there were all kinds of problems and fights. But at least they were kind of all Sunni Muslims. And, you know, in Syria, you've got Sunnis, the biggest single group. And obviously, Jolani represents that trend. And then you've got Alawites, Christians, Druze, Yazidis. You've got many other different
Kurds.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I wonder how much the goodwill will spread all across that tapestry. You can imagine those in Damascus, or maybe those who felt the brunt of what has happened across the civil war, wanting to just have a pause for a moment. But that's not to say all these different other groups there with their own varying interests might not want to stake a claim to that extra bit of land they've always wanted, or a higher position than they've already wanted.
And that when you remove the overarching central authority, you know, the hated regime, and you know, you go back into the history of Syria as part of the Ottoman Empire, where the external rulers, the Ottoman Turks, were always the ones who had to referee or ultimately come in and crush one group if they seemed to be threatening the overall stability. Now, in many of these countries, post-Ottoman, shall we call them, like Iraq, we've seen that when you remove that overarching authority, it's a formula for trouble, because all of these different interests, all of these different armed groups, no overarching central authority. So, yeah, given everything we know about how things can go wrong, and we've seen quite a bit of looting around government and Assad-related sites in Damascus in the last 24 hours, one has to have worries about that.
Just standing by the presidential palace. This is one of the palaces where President Assad used to live. It has turned into a looting picnic. Lots of people, many are coming from rural areas, broke into the palace, and they've just almost emptied it, destroyed everything and looted everything inside this building.
If I were Donald Trump, I would be saying, as he has been saying on Truth Social, I want nothing to do with this. It's nothing to do with us. Let them just sort it out amongst themselves. But of course, the US, the UK, other Western governments will be worried about, in this maybe ungoverned space, even if there is a bit of a stasis between these groups and not an all-out war between all of them, the worry about something like ISIS reemerging and getting a better foothold, or even some of those ISIS fighters and former fighters and families who are in those camps in Syria somehow making their way back to Europe in some instances and exporting that terrorism. How big a concern is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Luke, you channeling Donald Trump was not on my bingo card for this morning.
I didn't do the voice.
No, but let's unpack that because it's really important. I mean, firstly, you've got some actual simple procedural issues, even if Trump or the UK government or whatever wanted to lean in more, about HTS being prescribed as a terrorist organisation, about Jolani having a 10 million US bounty on his head as a terrorist. So even just talking to them, State Department or CIA or whatever, is potentially problematic.
And on Monday morning, we had Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, sort of de facto Deputy Prime Minister, suggesting that might be looked at. Now they are
US
sort of
and UK have both implied, well, it's going to get in the way of helping people and doing stuff. So then you've got this question of, well, does Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or whoever, these residual militant jihadist forces, try to take advantage of this situation? Now, what we saw yesterday was a lot of bombing by aircraft going on, and bizarrely, two different sets of aircraft from two different countries bombing for different reasons, both trying to take this moment of this state of flux, this pivot point between the old system and the new, to take advantage to try and prevent dangers as they see them from materializing. So the Americans hit 75 targets, mainly across the east of Syria, where they believe Islamic State groups were held up and maybe forming up in the pickup trucks or whatever to go off and try and seize land. So the Americans hit lots of them. I mean, that's a large scale of American military action compared to, what we'd seen, for example, over the last 14 months since October the 7th. Whether it's Islamic State, whether it's HTS, whether it's Hezbollah, it's a state of flux. Yeah.
Thinking about the ISIS dynamic, though, in a press release about that bombing campaign that you mentioned that happened at the end of the weekend, the US said that they were doing it in order to prevent ISIS from conducting external operations and to ensure that ISIS does not seek to take advantage of the current situation to reconstitute in central Syria. We haven't heard really in the mainstream media about ISIS for absolutely ages. Is it still, well, maybe just before all the events of the last few weeks, any kind of a threat? And what are the fears about what it could actually genuinely grow into and maybe export?
I think it's very hard to say. I mean, ISIS clearly had been ground down by the campaign that the US-led coalition had fought against it. It may be they've got a few thousand fighters now. They are weak, but the question is, in a state of flux, do they have various possibilities? Do they lay their hands on a lot more weaponry? Do we find a month or two down the line that there are political tensions, as there have been in the past, between HTS and some of the other militant Sunni groups, that maybe people start to drift away from HTS? Maybe ISIS starts to grow again. So those are the kind of things that America will be worried about and American intelligence will be worried about. And similarly, the Israelis will be worried that some group in Syria decides they're going to stand out from the crowd, as it were, by launching attacks across the Syrian border. And the Americans will have their agendas related to Islamic State.
There are these camps, sprawling camps in Syria, where lots of these sort of foreign former ISIS fighters still are.
Al-Hul is the big,
Save the Children says there are more than 60 British children amongst them. So that gives you a sense of the similar scale.
Exactly. This is a camp called Al-Hul, but it is in the area controlled by the SDF, which is this American-led, Kurdish-dominated security force. And Trump had said, I'm going to take the American troops out as soon as I can. There's only just under 1,000 there. And already various people in Congress are saying, whoa, maybe not the best time to remove America from this picture. I think highly likely that, notwithstanding Trump posting on social media that he's not going to get involved, I think keeping that American footprint there will be very useful, precisely to stop
some suit will get to him once he's in office and say, if you do this...
The deep state.
Yeah, the deep state will come and put a hand on his shoulder and say...
Yeah, Mr. President, we cannot let those hundreds of ISIS supporters that are still in places like Al-Hul camp, we can't risk them getting away. And, as we know, because of what happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon and how that then had this effect of undermining the whole Assad regime in Syria. Even quite small changes in terms of 1,000 troops here or a few thousand there can upset the delicate balance in parts of Syria. So, yeah, there'll be a lot of pressure on the US to keep that contingent there. It's not a big military commitment.
Zooming out, what has this done to the much broader picture and the axis of resistance? If you think about Iran and what's happened to its strategic partners in not just Syria, but also in Lebanon as well. Hezbollah was so weakened by what Israel's done to it that it couldn't come to Assad's rescue. Assad's departure from Syria mean that some of Iran's forward bases there and Russia's bases there are not yet necessarily at their disposal. Hamas in Gaza, obviously much weakened. Are we seeing an enormous shift? Are we seeing a chapter end and a new chapter start amidst all of this?
Well, it's an inflection point, that's for sure. 54 years of Assad regime brutality. At least, though, that was a constant in the calculations of the different regional actors. Now, as we've been talking about this state of flux, this state of unknown, people in the Middle East really don't like that. And I think it creates all sorts of possibilities and people will want to exploit it. I think another question concerns Iran itself. There are economic problems, there's strong opposition, and there's a population at large that sees the humiliation of the militant factions in Iran, the people who've been behind the Assad project being humiliated. That's dangerous, I think, for Ayatollah Khamenei and the people on that side of politics in Iran.
There's also a lesson for them, isn't there, that unpopular autocratic states can fail and fall a lot quicker than maybe you were expecting. If you're Khamenei or whoever in Iran, are you looking at what's happening in Syria and thinking...
That comes back to the kind of, like some people say about bankruptcy, little by little, then all of a sudden. Yeah. So it comes back to the nature of power in those countries. It is vital for power to be maintained for rulers in that situation in the Middle East to have the image of people who can use violence effectively and successfully, whether that's the violence of the dungeon, the torture chamber that we see being liberated now in Syria, or whether it's the use of aircraft dropping bombs, shock troops going in to retake suburbs of Aleppo, or things we saw in the Civil War. You have to be seen to be effective. And what's happened in Iran is the Israelis have successfully done things to them like taking down their whole air defense in one night and then hitting lots of key targets. Hezbollah, the jewel in the crown of the so-called axis of resistance, the Iranian-led militant forces across the region, has taken severe blows. And Assad, I think even more importantly, thousands of Iranians died propping up Assad. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of chants at football games and things about, don't send our money to Syria and don't send our money to Hamas and don't send. So there's a lot of popular anger with the Axis of Resistance project because a lot of Iranians facing economic hardship feel that billions. I mean, at one stage in the Syrian civil war, it was reckoned that Iranian assistance to Assad was running at $1 billion a month. People know that in Iran, and they know now that the whole thing has been for nothing. So it is very dangerous, I think, for the rulers of Iran.
Fascinating stuff. Mark, thank you so much.
Good to talk.
Mark Oban, who writes for the Sunday Times. Subscribers with the Times app or on thetimes.com can read all the latest analysis from Mark and the rest of the Times and Sunday Times team. And of course, there is continuing coverage of the unfolding situation in Syria over on Times Radio. The producers today were Edward Drummond and Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. And sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.